All right, that was such a nice introduction earlier. Thank you. That I don't need to reintroduce myself except to say good morning. I'm very glad to be with you this morning. And for anyone on Zoom, I'm Liz Hall. I'm the lead organizer of Common Ground. And a little bit about me. Maggie mentioned that I grew up in Long Beach in Southern California. Don't hold that against me. And my mother, I feel very Californian because my father is I'm fourth generation Californian on my father's side. His family came out during the Dust Bowl from Texas to work at the first Texaco gas station in El Centro on the US-Mexico border. And my mother is an immigrant. She immigrated in 1977 from England. So I think to be the child of an immigrant and the child of someone who has been in the state a long time makes me have a deeper maybe connection to this community than I might otherwise have had. My father was the oldest of 8 kids, and he became the patriarch of our family. Most of his brothers and sisters were raised in foster care, but stayed close to him over the years. And in the 1980s, when the recession hit, my family got hit really hard. People lost jobs, had aunts and uncles who lost their homes. They had to move further and further out of, if you know anything about Los Angeles, further and further out of the LA basin into the Inland Empire, even into the high desert on streets that were not paved, where there was no fire department in order to afford a place to live. And so every so often on a Saturday, my father would put us in the car and we'd drive out to see what was going on and deal with one of the crises hitting my family. And one day I remember being around, I think, 8 or 9 years old, and we drove out to my aunt's place. And I still remember seeing like the black smoke going up into the sky from the smoldering apartment building because there had been a fire. And the fire occurred because there was faulty wiring that the landlord didn't fix. And that day, it was my father and his brothers and sisters and me and my cousins, and the kids packed up their stuff and threw away anything that was too charred or too smelly to take, while the adults figured out where they were going to stay so the kids could stay in the same school district. So that was Saturday. And then on Sunday, my mother, as she always did, she took me to church. And on Sunday mornings, I heard about how we should care for the widow and the orphan, how we should take care of the poor. I heard about, in my tradition, I grew up Episcopalian, I heard about this thing called the kingdom of God that sounded so great, right? Where everybody had enough. But on Saturday, there was no church. There was no nonprofit. I never met a social worker until a friend of mine became one at UC Berkeley. So from a young age, I remember living on Saturday in what we might call the real world, right? The world as it is. But on Sunday, I got this vision of something different, which you might call the world as it should be. And we all have, I think, those two worlds inside of us. There's only really one world. That's this one that we live in right now, but we carry inside us, most of us, whether it's the kingdom of God, or I believe Unitarian Universalists have a strong utopian history of experimentation and creating, right? What does utopia look like? The world as it should be. We carry that within us. And when those worlds collide, it hurts. It's painful. It's excruciating to watch people we love suffer, to watch people in our community struggle. What are some of the things that you feel that way about? Just shout them out. Homelessness. What else? Hunger. Pardon? Housing. Addiction. What else? Depression. Racism. Abuse. Unfair taxation. Oppression. I can't help every time I come up to Napa thinking about fire and people who have lost so much, right, because of the fires that have gotten out of control in this part of the state. So what do we do with that? When those worlds collide, I think there can be a temptation to retreat into one or the other. If we retreat into only the world as it is, we lose that vision of something better, of something possible. We can become cynical. In fact, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that power, the world as it is, without love, the world as it should be, is brutal and corrosive. Right? So maybe we go to the other side. We want to live in utopia. We want to live in the world as it should be. We want to just be around people who think like us and want the things that we want and pretend that life is okay, right? We have a culture that tells us that, right? To not be depressed, right? Think positive. And what happens if we go to the other side and we forget the realities of suffering? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King says that love without power is sentimental and anemic. In fact, Ed Chambers, who was one of our national IAF co-directors before Ernie Cortez, said that the only ethical way to live is to remain in the tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be, that we have to live in that place, which is so hard and painful to live in, where we have, on one hand, the connection to the reality that is happening to our families, to our neighborhoods, to people we care about. And on the other hand, we are holding on to a belief that things can be better. And the only way we can live in that tension is to not do it alone. So we need other people. We need what we talk a lot about in broad-based organizing. We need power. Right? We need the power of other people. Bertrand Russell, who was, I believe, a great humanist, said that power requires, at its most basic form, two people and a plan. Right? So we need more than one person to be able to do something about these pressures, these challenges, the suffering that we face. And the good news, if you look around this room, is there are more than two people here. In fact, that's what I think Mr. Cortez refers to when he's talking about democracy. Democracy has been a great experiment. And maybe 30 or 40 years after the revolution, a French researcher named de Tocqueville came to the United States to look around and study and see how is this new democracy going. He was very concerned about the rise of Napoleon in his own country, just shortly after their own revolution, and he thought, well, There was a revolution here. How's it going? They have a different form of government. He went all over the country and met with different people and different communities. And then he wrote a book called Democracy in America, in which he concluded that it was bound to fail, that there was no hope except for an interesting phenomenon, which was across the United States, that people gathered in community in what he called these mediating institutions. They gathered in Rotary clubs. They gathered in congregational churches. They gathered for town hall meetings. They gathered in these groups where they got together and provided for people in these early communities and talked about what was going on and what we can do about it. And he said, if there is any hope for democracy, right? It's not the Constitution. It's not the president or some checks and balances between Congress. He said, if there is any hope for democracy, it is in those small mediating institutions where people get together, where they talk about what's going on, and they do something about it. So that is what we are about in Common Ground. How can we find and strengthen the mediating institutions of our time to keep democracy alive? And to get a little closer to the world as it should be. And that's why congregations like yours are so important to us. So you probably hear a lot about Common Ground. I want to share just a couple of stories from other places I have organized. One of them, when I was in Iowa, which is where they grow corn, not potatoes. Just that's Idaho. Okay, just in case you were wondering. Ohio is also a different state. Okay, so Iowa's right smack in the middle of the country. When I was organizing in Iowa, there was a church, First Christian Church. They now renamed themselves, I think, New Beginnings. And there was a woman there who got interested in organizing. She had been part of our organizing effort. It's called Amos there, not Common Ground, but same idea. She had been part of it, years before, had gotten involved in other things, and came back and said, I really feel like this is important. And so what she started to do was not typical when you think about social justice work. So she didn't choose an issue and try to convince everybody that they should care about it. She didn't show a documentary. She didn't start a book study. She started having one-on-one meetings with people, asking them for coffee. Would they spend 30 minutes with her talking about their lives? She had 10 of these meetings, and then she came to see me. And she said, I met with 10 people in my congregation, and every single one of them is either a parent, a grandparent, or a teacher who talked about children's mental health. And in 10 conversations, she realized there was a children's mental health epidemic going on in that community. And she said to me, it wasn't until she had these 10 conversations that she remembered that 25 years before, her own daughter had ended up in the hospital as a teenager because of mental health concerns. And she never told anyone at the church about it. And she said, I feel like now I have an obligation to make sure nobody else feels like they cannot tell us this is going on. All 10 of these people had never brought it up before. So she started having more one-on-ones. She started talking to people in other congregations and nonprofits in our organization, and they started asking people about this. And one day in February, in the middle of a blizzard, 60 people trudged through the snow into their parish hall to have a house meeting about children's mental health. They talked to each other and told their stories. One of them was a principal from the Unitarian church. She was an elementary principal who said there was a kid at her school who ran out into the middle of the street and threw himself in front of oncoming traffic. And thankfully, she ran out and she and the staff, they caught him before anything happened. The only people she had to call were the police, who came, handcuffed him, and put him in the back of a squad car. She said, I desperately need somebody else to call. Because of that woman at First Christian Church and those conversations, 2 years later, in Des Moines, Iowa, if you have a child with a mental health crisis, you can call a phone number and a crisis team with a social worker will come out to where you are, whether it be school or your home, and work with that child. And that there is a crisis center where that child can be taken, not in a squad car, but in a regular vehicle. That is what we are about. The Unitarian church I worked with in Des Moines, they actually started using house meetings, small group conversations like this, for stewardship. They used them around their new minister search. But they also, over time, began using them in all kinds of different ways, to the point that at a dinner one night, someone showed up and there had just been major rains, and she said, my house just flooded for the 3rd time, and the insurance will not pay enough for us to fix the damage. Because of her story and others like it, they eventually passed a sales tax that paid for flood prevention infrastructure in that city. So, just a couple of examples. Now, in Common Ground, right now we're working, as you may have heard, to protect renters from eviction. We're working on housing and homelessness. We're working on police oversight in the city of Vallejo. Every one of those issues emerged out of a conversation, one-on-one in small groups, out of people in an institution caring for one another by asking the question. Sometimes I think we can get the idea that when an organizer comes to talk to you, my job is to try to get you to go do what I want you to do. But I'm not here to ask you to work on homelessness or housing or protecting renters from evictions or police oversight, or to even to come to anything. David and Maggie can ask you about that later. What I'm here to say is that the very most important organizing work that we do starts in this room with conversation, with rebuilding our capacity to talk about what's going on in the world as it is, so that together we can do something about it. I chose the prayer that I read earlier because it helps me remember that we will never see the world as it should be. But that doesn't mean we can't create more and more glimpses of it in the world as it is. And there's another quote from the Talmud that I like that I'll close with, that you may have heard. It's also like become a popular meme on Facebook. Do not despair at the condition of the world. Act justly now, walk humbly now. Your task is not to finish the work, but neither are we exempt from beginning it.